Okay, thank you all for coming. I hope you're not too tired from lunch, which for me was as delicious as it was yesterday and the day before, and dinner and breakfast. One of the many reasons I'm happy to be here. My name is Stien van der Ploeg. I lead animal charity Evaluators. I came here from Chicago in America. And I'm very proud to be here. And just a couple days ago, I pretty much didn't know any of you, and I never met any of you in person, with the exception of maybe one or two. And now I'm very happy to see that I know so many of these kind faces. But I'm mostly happy to be here to learn from people like the three speakers that you'll be hearing from now. Before we get into that, I moderated a session earlier. I asked the audience 2 questions and asked them then also for a small favor. I'm going to do the same thing here and see what the answers are. First question, if English is the language you're most comfortable in, that you speak basically morning to night, can you raise your hand? Okay, oh, that's quite a lot actually, much more than in the previous audience. And then I should have raised my hand for that one too. I won't for the next question. If you think speaking in front of an audience is easy and it doesn't make you nervous at all, can you raise your hand? Ah, one of the speakers, great. Oh, okay, a couple. But absolutely, most of you are not comfortable doing that. So we're in a situation where there's 3 speakers who are going to sit up there who are maybe some are not nervous, and about half of you don't speak English that often. So I hope you can all be as quiet as possible, and so that all of us can really pay attention to the speakers, give them our full focus so that we can learn as much as possible. Sound okay? Okay, thank you. So then to the content. I was a little bit nervous when I saw the description, because it is all about getting super brilliant ideas from brainstorming. And I think actually these 3 speakers are quite capable of doing that. But it also seemed that it would probably be very fun for us to sit here for an hour and spew as many and as creative ideas as possible. We weren't really sure if that is the most effective use of your time. So hopefully you're not too disappointed that we're shifting the format a little bit and are focusing a little bit more on idea creation than fully on brainstorming. Because we want to get to a place where we have more inspiration and more ideas on how to build a stronger movement here in Asia, one that is more resilient and more effective. But I don't want to take the brainstorming away from you completely. Actually, I want to put it on you. So if during this conversation you are inspired and come up with either brilliant or silly or creative ideas, put them in the Whova app, and then also vote on each other's brainstorm ideas, and then the top voted ones will present to the speakers at the end of our conversation. And remember that with brainstorming, it's quantity over quality, it's creativity over feasibility, and there's no criticism or shaming, so have fun with it. Put your fun ideas in there. Let's see. Yeah, I guess I'll get to introducing the 3 of you, so I don't sit here by myself. Yeah, I'll take that order. Shweta Sood, she is now the let's say, global VP of Marketing and Communications, right? At Mercy for Animals. And yes, please, applause is welcome. Originally, she studied literature at the University of Delhi, and since then she has also worked at 50 by 40 and at FIAPO, also in India. And she isn't just specialized in animal welfare, but also in food systems and in inclusivity. So she works at the nexus of all of these things and has a special expertise also in grassroots work in India. Next up, who is Wong Lee, also with Mercy for Animals, actually. Somewhat recently, is that right? Okay. Elin is going to be, or is leading the, she's based here in KL and is working and leading the strategy and operations work of Mercy for Animals here in Malaysia, so for the whole country, but has been involved, and I think I read this right, in animal welfare since 1996. Wow. And the environmental movement as well, first as a volunteer at the SPCA, and later also as a manager there, and so now here with the Southeast Asian perspective. Then lastly, David Peterson with the World Federation for Animals, and is leading the growth of advocates globally, and also making sure that we leverage our collective altruism for the movement and for animals. Also long experience, not just in animal welfare, so that's something that these three have in common, also working in food systems and in, I think, environmental work. And you might also know him from all of the work at 50 by 40, so there's multiple connections here, which he helped set up. And yeah, so we have a global perspective, we have a grassroots perspective, and a Southeast Asian perspective. Please join me now so that I don't sit here by myself. Thank you. Maybe one more round of applause for all of them. Okay, let's see. What do I want to ask you first? So yeah, I think I want to start with a question for all three of you. So we keep talking about how the movement here, about how this community is still relatively young, and considering the population of both human and non-human animals in this region, how big that is, that the movement is still also relatively small. So it makes sense that we look abroad, look at maybe the animal welfare movement in America or in Australia, and try and learn from them. But it seems maybe especially helpful to also look at the more established movements that exist in this region that are not focused on animal welfare, but on other cause areas, let's say climate or social development, environment. Let's see what you think about that.
Hello? Okay, it works. Hi. Thanks for the introduction. By the way, as well, I also have a massive imposter complex all the way, but it's really nice to hear this beautiful introduction of us. It always boosts up a little bit. Yeah, well, to your question, and yeah, we're also used to work in that intersection. Someone once said that the animal advocacy movement is sort of the orphans of the social justice movements. So meaning basically it's going to be a little while till we reach the kind of critical mass that human rights have achieved, and there's still a long way to go, or when it comes to climate change and so on. So I think it's essential that we connect with these movements. And I think the way we do it is by sort of learning their priorities, learning their language. And I think a lot of people in this room and in the movement abroad already have highly educated themselves around food systems, climate change, zoonotic diseases is a new one coming up. And so there's already all this knowledge, and I think there's already a lot of people sort of using that to connect with, bridge, and support the sort of knowledge gaps that the existing movement has around COP and UNFCCC, for example. So I think we're already doing that, but I think it's when we do that, it's very, it's very crucial that there's the saying, first seek to understand, then to be understood, that we truly listen. It's not just, coming to a meeting, for example, and listening with half an ear and then saying vegan for the rest of the hour, right? It's like, there's a lot of these priorities, and animal welfare intersects with all of these, right? It's not that it's a sort of a mystery that just comes in and we try and squeeze it in. Animal welfare is super important to pandemic prevention, that you're probably familiar with livestock accounts for a lot of greenhouse gas emissions and so on. So sort of to sum up, I think we need to show all these other movements that we can be, as I call it, friends with co-benefits. think that's very, very important.
Okay, we have to remember that Southeast Asia has a long history of vegetarianism and high familiarity with plant-based foods, but the vegan advocacy movement is very young. Traditionally, vegetarian groups and faith groups do not engage in advocacy. So, but what we can leverage on is the long history of the environmental movement and companion animal welfare movement. And we try to find common grounds with all these different movements. And we employ linguistic and cultural nuances. For example, when we are speaking to the environmental movement, we might say that plant-based food is climate-friendly food. If, for example, when I work with the unhoused community and I'm speaking to donors as to why we are giving out vegan food, we say it's the most halal food there is, it's the most inclusive food there is, it's non-violent. So if you believe in social justice and peace, it's the most non-violent and peaceful food there is. So we work across the entire community. We reach out to groups we traditionally do not include in farmed animal welfare advocacy and vegan advocacy. We work with youth groups, volunteer groups, the environmental movement, and also with religious groups, because religious personalities can be key opinion leaders, and also with the local communities. I'm going to use the example of the turtle conservation movement in Malaysia. In order to get a ban on the sale of turtle eggs codified, it took us more than 20 years. Because initially there was no political will, and because it's enacted in different states, in states in which there was great support for the consumption of turtle eggs, they knew that the electorate would not support the ban. So we worked with the local imams of mosques, with village heads, with community leaders, until we got the support of a majority of the population, and the popularity of consumption of turtle eggs went down. And only then we were able to get laws banning the sale of turtle eggs codified. So I see the same pattern in companion animal welfare. It took us almost 20 years for TNR and companion animal adoption from shelters and pounds and rescue movements to reach the level of support and awareness it has in Malaysia now. I think we are at a very satisfactory level. And it will probably take that long for the vegan movement to gain hold in Southeast Asia, but we are in it for the long haul.
Thanks, Lynn. I think I heard that question from you. First of all, thanks for the amazing introduction. I don't think I've heard a better introduction of myself. I think I heard your question in two parts. I just want to, so what is it that we can learn from the movement, and then how do we collaborate with them, was what I heard. And I think to me, when we think about learning from like other movements that have already existed, and I'm particularly thinking about the climate movement, for example, or the LGBTQ movement, I think one thing that they've done very successfully is they've got the messaging right. And I think we work with a particularly painful, difficult, ugly reality that we live with. And I think it's really important to hit the right balance of urgent and positive messaging, which I think some movements have done really well. And I think similarly to kind of have a collective message that we can get behind. So for example, like we see the 1.5, every single climate activist rallies around the 1.5. What is the 1.5 for us? So I think for us to be able to have that learning from those movements, I think that'll be something that's really cool. I think also when we think about social models that have existed, social movement models, the energy movement is a very good example. We've seen us transition from coal to now renewable energy, and there's like an entire kind of transition map that already exists. We need the same thing for food. We have a broken food system. We need to transition to one that works for us. What does that food transition look like? How do we kind of use the learnings that we've already had over there and get them in our movement, begin working at maybe that big picture level and see like how do we kind of then trickle down that effect. So I think as far as learning is concerned, that's where my head goes. When we think about collaboration in Asia, I feel maybe more so than the West, Asia is very culture first. So I think that has to be something that we keep at heart when we're thinking about collaboration, that it can't be tokenist. It has to be meaningful. And I think I kind of say this every time. Like when sometimes we think of collaboration, it's like, hey, we're going to go participate in this run that is for LGBTQ and we'll get the animal message out there. And I think it has to be that, but it also has to be more meaningful than that. So what do long-term collaborations look like? Who are the right partners for us? So I think climate is like an obvious partner. I think faith is another one that you mentioned. Faith also because faith is so intertwined with food. And how do we use that angle to kind of build this messaging within it? Audre Lorde, who is an American poet, as you would know from my English kind of background, had this quote that said, there are no single-issue struggles because we don't live single-issue lives. And food systems are intersectional by default. How do we use that intersectionality today to be strategic about who we collaborate with? I think that's how I imagine this.
Yeah, thank you. I think I have immediately a follow-up question for you and then possibly for all of you. That same question. When we talk about movements like this, the first thing you have to think about is people, right? That's what constitutes a movement. So how do you view, especially with your grassroots background, how do you see the role of building people power to build the animal welfare movement and community?
Oh, I love this question. I think to me, I feel like the bedrock of almost any social justice movement is people power. So when we think of, Gandhi and the Salt March, it's based on people power. When we think of Martin Luther King, even when we think of like Black Lives Matter or Greta, they're all kind of trigger events that started like people movements. So I think people power sits at the bedrock even of like the welfare changes that we're making today. So we're able to do cage-free because we have pressure building. So to me, I think there's a bedrock that is formed by people power. Do you want me to answer how to build that or like?
Yeah, right?
Yeah. I think to me, building kind of people power really comes from a lot of education and a lot of effort. So it starts with us educating. I think I was having this conversation with someone at this conference, and I know at least 7-8 people whom I've spoken to over here who have come because I was leafleting back in 2013. So I think there is like a benefit to doing organizing and outreach and these vegan fests and conferences and movies that we're recruiting more people to the movement. And I think we're also able to kind of add some degree of social sanction to what is otherwise very fringe. So I think we have this idea of, like obviously when we go out of this room or of these circles, we feel no one's really talking about animal rights. It's not commonplace. So I think to find these safe havens where we can have these conversations, where we can find our sense of community, I think that's kind of inherent to building people power. And when we have that on a regular basis, when we have people take action, little steps, transformational steps every day, is when we'll be able to shift how people think. So that's when, so I think incremental benefits can come from welfare campaigns, but I think if we're talking about transformational shifts, they will always come from kind of people power and movement building.
Do you want to add to that?
Okay, I'm going to start with a why. Why do we need to build people power? Shouldn't we focus on direct action and direct rescue work? Well, I've been in the cage-free campaign movement for more than 3 years. And what we see over and over again is that corporations will respond to our emails, but there's no consumer demand. Nobody wants more expensive eggs. If we were to write to them and say that this is what consumers want, this is what our country deserves, this is what Asian societies deserve, they say there's no demand. People aren't asking for cage-free eggs. They're asking for a steady supply of eggs at a very low price. So how do we address this? We can't do campaign work without first mobilizing a large proportion of society. And how do we do that? We do that by creating a movement, building a movement, enhancing it, empowering them. And we do that by being as inclusive and welcoming as possible. So those of us in the animal protection movements, we need to welcome everyone. We need to say, you don't have to be vegan. You just have to care about animals. You just have to care about the environment. You just have to care about people who are more vulnerable than you are, right? Come and join us. We learn from each other. And also, we need to remember that everyone has something to share with us, and there's something we can learn from everyone. So if we are working with people from, say, the low-income communities, we can learn about their struggles, the challenges they face, and from there we learn what are their barriers to switching to a plant-based diet. What are some of the barriers they are faced with? So from there we build a movement. We help remove these obstacles one by one. And when it comes to the animal agriculture movement, we know it's a system that's broken. I'm going to use an analogy that Dr. Jane Goodall used in Harvest for Hope, that we pull the threads out of the system one by one. And that's how we build the movement, and that's why it's critical. Not just writing letters to corporations, it's not mutually exclusive. We can do both at the same time. We engage with corporations and producers and financial institutions, and we lobby governments, but at the same time, we build the movement. We help create awareness. So we can't be the angry vegans. We have to be the inspiring vegans. We have to be the encouraging vegans, the ones that people want to be a part of.
Well, thanks. And yeah, brilliant points, I think, on how we get people on board and use maybe pressure campaigns as sort of gateway drugs to get them on board with other types of activism and so on. So I'll speak a bit more to maybe the existing movement, for example, this room and beyond. I usually tell people you don't get rich in the traditional sense of the word in our movement, but you get to meet some of the most passionate, driven people that I've ever met, and I call that my spiritual pay raise, and I wouldn't change it for a job on Wall Street. And so these are the people we have to invest in, right, as well, to sort of the long-term resilience of the movement. And there's this management meme. There's these two managers that are talking to each other, and one of them is complaining, but like, come on, what about if we invest that much time and energy in our people and then they leave us, you know? And the other guy says, yeah, but what if we don't and they stay, you know? So I think there's a good point on sort of, one is emotional resilience, psychology, preventing burnout and things. Another is sort of the upskilling of the people here. So we have at least one studying literature. I study philosophy. I read dead people. It's not necessarily like a very translatable skills, but there's a lot that, as you talked about intersectionality in the food systems, there's so many things. There's worker right. We need to have lawyers to sue people. We need to have, campaigners to organize and so on. I was just in Brussels, and I met this guy, the leader of the World Animal Protection in Netherlands. He has a background, I think, in literature or history as well. And when they came into the Netherlands, he was very conscious of when they set up there that there's an existing ecosystems of a lot of animal protection advocacy groups already. So to not come in and step on other people's toes or funding streams. He said, what's our niche? And then he said, okay, it's a very high welfare country. They have a lot of pension funds. And these pension funds and these banks, they invest in a lot of things that are not always that ethical, one of them being factory farming. So this is what he started going down this rabbit hole, and now it was a very interesting talk I had with him for like 30 minutes, or monologue maybe, but it's very interesting. And he knows so much about financial flows and systems and how to get banks to, invest, and what does CSR policies, SDG commitments, and all this. And I think this is interesting when you meet people here and you ask them, what's your background? One of them says, and sitting over there, I started a dating app because I want to engage the community, right? And there's a lot of different stories here, and I think this is also something we need to be thinking about. There's not really a vegan academy yet, right? There's all these different things, and I think we can do more in terms of long-term investing in people. I think that gateway drugs are not enough. You need to keep them. So.
You just mentioned Brussels, so I think I want to continue a little bit more on your global perspective. From that global perspective, what do you think are kind of like the key or critical components of building a movement?
I would, yeah. Well, these are just. I think there's a lot to say on that. I think so. I can't get around all of it. I would mention sort of like four things that I think, and they're more. Not. I don't think it's very new to people, but it's something I want to emphasize. And I think something we need to keep top of mind. One is unity. And shared purpose, I think, is important. Collaboration over competition is important. Broadening the movement, as we talked about, to other movements, not going to get into that. And then proactivity and planning. So the first one, you're familiar with Oscar Wilde, he once said, a map without utopia is not even worth glancing at. I think this is for a lot of people in this room. This is our motivation, our drive, our sort of benchmark. But I think for most people here, actually, if you look at their sort of opinions and what their mission statements of their organizations and so on are, we agree on 99% of the world we want to see on the utopia. So it's very important we don't spend too much time discussing the 1%. We can always burn that bridge when we get there, I think. That's also sort of the purpose of 50 by 40, sort of common denominator we could agree on with other movements, climate movements and so on. Not like a vegan world necessarily, but maybe a halfway step, and we can discuss from there. So after saying it's really important that we always let our commonalities sort of unite us and our differences strengthen us, because we are this diverse movement with people studying literature and philosophy and everything in between, and hopefully a little bit beyond. The second point, collaboration over competition. I think it's very obvious when we're here, that's what this conference is for, and there's a lot of existing coalitions. This is hosted by a great one already, Asia for Animals. So collaboration is not something new, but one sort of thing I noticed like a couple of years back, I think kind of with the introduction of effective altruism into the DNA of the movement, there started to be these kinds of organizations that, not that they're not actually doing anything, but they're not public facing, they're not facing consumers, they're not facing corporates, they're not facing policymakers, they're facing internally in the movement. So one being your organization, Animal Charity Evaluators, evaluating charities, sort of streamlining strategies around impact and evidence. We have animal advocacy careers that some of you are familiar with. They're sort of bridging talent gaps in the movement. And my point here is the identity of these organizations, if I can maybe speak for yours, is that they see themselves as part of a large ecosystem, right? And they want to contribute exactly to their point. I think this is the sort of new development, there's a maturity of our movement as such. Yet another lesson I think we can draw from that, and I think most people here would agree, but if you're working in a different organizations that actually are sort of sharing the same goals and strategies, cage-free campaigns, and you're in the same country and so on, there's still this opportunity, and there's something like a mindset we should cultivate to actually see ourselves as part of this, like your own individual organization's contribution should be seen as like part of the larger ecosystem. And for me, it's like on a personal level, but also an organizational thing that we need to see that, not in terms of competition, right? So I think in order to get to that point where we can do that more, and I think we're already quite there, it's not something completely new. Two key things, I think, is trusts and vulnerability. And trust is built by openly sharing failures. If those of you who are familiar with the FAST listserv, this newsletter sort of in the movement, or listserv, there's this guidelines that when you share, this is a campaign, we got these to go cage-free, what are the tactics that work, and what are the tactics that don't, right? So I think that's a good premise, right? Because there's this wise man who said, good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment, right? So there's this nice circular effect, and I think as a movement, part of what we get is sort of a group discount on learnings from failures, right? And just personally speaking, I think one of my greatest failures have been some of my greatest lessons, and actually a lot of people who haven't known me for that long time is actually very surprised when I tell them I haven't always been perfect. So I think it's very important to sort of deliver ourselves in that way. And I think this trust is very key to build this foundation we need to be having these hard conversations that you need in any dysfunctional family or larger ecosystem, because we need to be talking about collective priority setting, distribution of funding as well. And these are kind of like sensitive topics, but we need that trust to exist first, right? And we built that through among others, trust building. Also meeting in person, I think. It's very, as some of you might know, it's very easy to argue with a stranger on Facebook, but if you had sat on a panel together otherwise, right, it's harder. Then I also mentioned other movements. We talked about that. I'm not going to get into that. The final point I want to make is about proactivity and planning, meaning not reactivity, not reacting to events, but actually start sort of looking into the periscope, what's out in the future. And I think, again, here we need this shared unity and purpose. We need this trust as well to build that on. Let me just see here. To plan ahead. And I think because as we mature and we bridge the talent gaps and so on. We need to start looking at sort of the future and what are the things we can proactively react to. Planning, we need to come together collectively and set these priorities, not just individual ones, sort of competing ones, right? And here, there's a lot of different ways we can do that. I think Open Wing Alliance is an example of doing that in the cage-free commitment scene. I would like to highlight policy as sort of a slightly neglected space. And for me, when I think of policy and global policy or regional policy, I also like to highlight Ngoc An from Asia for Animals, who's doing a lot of great organizing around policy here in Asia, Southeast Asia. For me, policy is sort of the end game. You know, it's what this is how we lock in the progress that we make on the consumer front, that we make on cage-free commitments, for example. So kind of how you lock in that individual cage-free commitments don't slide back, right? It's a long term, but of course, individual organizations' day-to-day priorities might focus on the quicker wins, but we need to start building capacity and looking ahead to where we want to go to build this utopia. And I think in this, in policy, there's also a bigger sense of this great saying, the rising tide lifts all boats. So when we have everyone, I love cage-free commitments. It's not bashing against that, but there's a bigger sense of, I think, when we have a policy win, it kind of covers more. The rising tide lifts all boats, and I think there's a more sense of shared victory and benefits as well, because the sort of foundation of what we're doing our outreach on sort of raises. And I think this, it also provides often sort of a policy target, if it's well structured and well planned out. It provides a very tall banner for a lot of people to unify around, right? So, and this ties back into the shared vision and purpose that I think we need as well. And again, this tall banner, I think, and policy space also provides a really good playground to engage with other movements. So let's say around climate change and others, because that's the end goal for a lot of these movements, right? So yeah, that's basically my point. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the plug too. I appreciate it. I also appreciated that I didn't know any of you really before this weekend, and it's really nice to see that we're so aligned, and I really appreciate that you're also mission-centric. And I've noticed that in this room and at this conference as a whole, that you really place animals first, not your organization or your own ideas, and I really appreciate that. You mentioned talent gaps, for instance, and I also want to ask a little bit more about gaps, and I promise then I'll take a look at my phone and see what kind of ideas you've come up with. But maybe this is a question for you first, Lynn. Besides talent gaps, if we want to build a resilient, sustainable, strong community of animal advocates, we need to know what the gaps are, what are we missing, what type of information and roles, what type of people do we need, do you think, to grow?
From my experience, I think that academic research has largely left out, let's say, the informal food market, which makes up 50 to 80% of the food market in Asia. So most food businesses are not part of any chain, they are not part of any franchise. It's harder to regulate, it's harder to secure any sort of commitment, it's harder to demand accountability from them. There's very little transparency. Also, many farms, livestock farms in Asia are smallholder farms. Villagers can have as few as 20 heads of cattle, and that's mostly for sale within their own villages. So this is where more data and research is needed, and we are probably not going to get it from conventional sources of information like Google and government reports and research conducted by organizations and conventional scholarship. So also I think that there's a knowledge gap when it comes to issues like the attrition rate of vegans and vegetarians in Asia. We don't know how many people are backsliding. Many people go vegetarian as part of a religious vow. If they leave the faith, or if they feel that the vow has been fulfilled, how many remain vegan? How many remain vegetarian? What are their barriers to continuing? Why did they backslide? There are knowledge gaps here. So in order to get information like this is why it's important to collaborate with different groups, faith groups, local communities, community leaders, different organizations across the board, people working on things like costs of living and food security issues.
Thanks for sharing that, Elaine. I think I want to just kind of use that as a segue almost into what you were saying. I think when we talk about behavior change, like is someone becoming vegan? Is someone changing their diet? Very often, like I think we don't think about attitude shifts. We think about behavior shifts. And behavior shifts are where we see recidivism. So that's where we'll say, oh, like 5 out of 6 vegans slip back into like older habits. If we are able to shift attitudes, if we are able to shift the way people think about animals, which in our Eastern culture of philosophy of like, there is such a sense of ahimsa philosophy, like it is so deeply ingrained in our culture. If we are able to tap into that sensibly, a big part of which will be movement building, will be kind of being in the public consciousness repeatedly, everyday people taking everyday actions against small and big injustices. I think that will be a game changer in the long run. So I just wanted to make that point about transformational change and attitudinal change will come from every person doing a little bit, which will come from movement building. So I think just to tie a bow around that point. But I think as far as gaps in the movement, and I think you kind of listed the biggest one, and I actually was very keen on understanding this gap myself, and I had even at some point of time conducted like qualitative interviews within India about it. And to me, like I think the biggest things that came up, which you already mentioned, was talent. Like talent acquisition and retention were the biggest gaps that came up. I have a direct quote that I've written here. It said, like, we want better work culture, better money, and a lot more focus in what we're doing. So it was very clear in what the kind of demands were coming out of the Asian movement. And I think that in particular, to me, what my own experience has also been early on was that it was like somewhat like being thrown into the ocean and learning how to swim, you know. So there's a lot of kind of learning that's happening on the job. One day you're doing admin, the second day you're doing campaigning, the third day you're doing communications, and it's not like you have a lot of strong skill building through all of this, so someone's kind of holding your hand through all of this. So I think the combination of kind of work culture, doing these different things, not feeling paid enough, having that pressure at home where your parents are like, are you still really like, whatever, working for dogs and cats or working for animals? You know, I'd much rather you be like a sales executive somewhere. Like that's a very common shared experience that we all have. Like, why are you doing this? And there's so much, and I think that changes when you're able to say, yeah, I'm doing this and this is my particular skill set. And this is the focus that my job brings in. This is the money that I get. These are the travel and learning opportunities that I'm going to the UN, I'm going to be speaking on stage, like that adds, those things add value. So to me, I think talent acquisition, talent retention, being in the right places, like why are we not able to catch, why are the best and brightest minds of our generation selling shoes, like selling Adidas, like, or, you know, why are they not in the movement? Why are we not able to get them here? That's because we need to be present where people are hiring. So I think figuring the talent cycle out, right from kind of attraction to retention to what's the long-term plan, what are the growth opportunities for people? Where does someone who's been in this movement for 5 years in Asia go? Usually they go global, you know. So what is that room within Asia? How do we grow that? I think to me that's the gap right now.
David, is there a gap besides talent that you already mentioned that you want to highlight?
No, I think it's very common. I think, well, education, the continued, you kind of were talking about that as well. Well, I would say there's probably, if we tie sort of again in with other movements, so if we look at like recently, I guess like 2012, we suddenly sort of attracted like it's kind of like a, how to say, a movement that's sort of on the sideline with ours. There's a panel in a bit on alternative protein. So we started tapping into a lot of Silicon Valley talent who were entrepreneurs, probably paid better than most of the people here, But they sort of, okay, sustainability, it's a lot of other buzzwords, and it's for profit, it's a lot of other things. So, because we need to build a whole industry, right, to sort of compete. So I think there may be other ways of thinking about that. Let's say medical research, for example. It's not that I have any bright ideas on that, but vegan, whole food, plant-based diets, again, I'm a philosopher, nothing I say counts as neither medical or legal advice. But my sense is, from what I talk to people, that it's very healthy, you can solve a lot of problems. And it's like there should be all these other both challenge and money pools we should be able to tap into. And I'm not sure that we're the best representative, but maybe we can get the spark started. Again, I don't have bright ideas for it, but that seems to be at least the sort of the end game, or what we need to be start thinking about.
As I said, in brainstorming, bright ideas are not required. Okay, let me see what's in the app here. Okay. In the corporate engagement, I think it's helpful to be open to listen to what the corporations have to say and collaborate with them. It might be a lot of excuses, but the collaboration, it will help them and us to move forward. What are your thoughts? How much should we listen to them? I think this is a question for all three of you.
I believe we should see corporations, at least initially, as our allies. We have to assume that everyone has good intentions. Even taking care of your company, making sure it's profitable so that you can take care of your employees, especially in Asia, is seen as their primary duty. Hey, we are not operating a charity here. We are not running an animal shelter or a farm sanctuary. We are operating a company. It has to be profitable. Otherwise, we can't take care of our people. And we have to meet them where they are and say, all right, so these are your barriers to making this particular change, to making a commitment, a written commitment, and how do we make the commitment binding? If there's no accountability, they are not following up on it, we have to meet them where they are, and we have to help them address the issues one by one. Okay, issue is supplier, let's get the suppliers to meet the possible producers. Can we come up with a binding, time-bound contract? Can both parties agree, okay, I will supply to you at this rate for 12 months, I will make sure a steady supply is available. And what are some of the alternatives if there's a force majeure situation, if the contract falls apart, it needs to be terminated halfway, are there other measures they can take? So we have to see corporations as neutral. We can't see them as evil. We can't see omnivores and carnivores as evil. We have to see them as neutral. We have to meet them where they are. We have to understand where they're coming from, the challenges and obstacles they're facing, what are some of the preconceived notions they may have, and then we have to address it one by one, and we have to mitigate all the problems that they may be facing. So I'm all for working with corporations. I see them as neutral.
I think my very quick strategic answer to that question is, how big is the corporation? Like, what is the benefit that we're getting out of listening to them? Are they like, how many eggs, like, are they responsible for? If they're really big, if it will have like I will make a lot of effort to listen to them and be able to kind of show up in the best way possible. So I think that's part one. Part two is, what phase is the program in? And I think, to me, like, when I'm thinking about corporate engagement, it's slightly different from working within like an allyship that exists very, very within the movement. And I think, I would say, what phase is the program at? Are we piloting things? If you're piloting things, we should be open to listening to all the feedback that's coming and to be able to try and test different things as much as we can. So that by the end of the year, you've tried like 4 different things and you've reached a model where we now know this works. So this is where we start listening. This is where we start putting pressure. This is where we're putting pressure internally. This is where we're going external with it. So I think in year one, or when you're piloting, everything goes, listen thoroughly, do your testing, and then if you have a solution, then see what works. Yeah.
Thanks. Not much other wisdom to add, but remember I was working when I was 50 or 40, this other environmental NGO, and there's a woman there who called it the Green Shield. She would always get on the phone, the CSR department, who had absolutely no influence or decision-making power. But it's kind of like when you go online with your net bank or some other things you want to fix online, and then they give you this chatbot. And it just keeps leading you in circles and somewhere around the internet, and we'll get back to you. They never ask you, do we want a real human who can actually answer your question? So I think at some point you need to, okay, are we facing this, right? Is that what we're facing? On another note, I think I completely agree, we need to listen to them. I think in not assuming ill intentions other than wanting to make profit, which can be not necessarily a bad thing or so on, but also it can lead to overriding decisions or sliding back on cage-free commitments. But I think understanding how they work, right? This is also part of our education, right? I once gave a presentation to, there's someone from the Danish Agricultural Ministry, and I was talking about the alternative protein rise in the market. And there's been a lot of even commitments or investments now from, let's say, Canada or Israel as governments, or Singapore investing in alternatives, right? And I mentioned these developments to her, and then I had at the end of the slide, I had this question saying that the world's protein portfolio is growing. What will be Denmark's role? Benchmarker or bench warmer? And I can see this sort of anxiety in her eyes, like, okay, what are we doing as a nation? It's like, actually, when you look at it, not a lot, right? And now Denmark, it's not due to my little slide or pun there, but they've started investing a lot in it. And I think understanding the mechanisms why, and also the sort of competition, so cage-free can actually, lead to growth in market expansion. It's kind of the future-proofing your supply chain and all these things. So in terms of sort of listening and understanding their incentives and motives very, very deeply, right? I think listening comes into that and not tying it into like good or evil or something like that. Yeah.
Thank you all. Thank you too for Maho. I forgot to credit you for your excellent question. We have time for one more quick question. Nicole, she asked about her time running GFI International. They had meetings every other week where the leaders of the GFI, so the Good Food Institute, offices in India, China, Brazil, Europe, and Israel, met to talk about strategies and lessons learned. It was hugely effective. How can we do a better job as a movement in sharing the lessons learned and strategies across cultures and areas of the world? Please solve that.
I think that sounds like a brilliant idea. Maybe we could hire Nicole to run such a ongoing workshop. I would sort of point to cultural nuances. I'm from a very, very small country, like 5 million. It's not even this city. So we have to learn to be very diplomatic because we can't win any wars. And how to say, so we learn to navigate a lot and be very diplomatic. And I think when you look at the culture here in general, and I can't generalize across all of Southeast Asia, it's too diverse. But one thing I noticed, it's that doesn't have this slogan, America first, right? This kind of attitude. There's not, I think sometimes, and we're talking about this when you have, let's say, between introverts and extroverts, there's this saying, don't ask the introvert to puff up and be more, extroverted, but actually ask the extrovert to allow a bit of space, for the other one to come in. I think that's sort of very general, but I think that's something we can learn to provide spaces and sometimes prop up or provide guidelines where it's not just the person who jumps into the karaoke bar first, that always gets the saying. I think so spaces where we have guidelines that direct, and I think we sometimes need to incentivize or prop up or whatever you'd call it, I think, to create these spaces where we can share these. Yeah.
You both work for large international organizations too. Do you want to respond?
I think platforms and coalitions such as Open Wing Alliance are very helpful, so that movements that are newer can learn from those that are more established. We also receive forms of mentorship and assistance. It also forms part of our capacity building. If we are new in the movement, we've just applied for a grant, we've just received a grant, we are doing everything ourselves, from educational talks to corporate campaigns to fundraising. How can we build our skills, and how do we know what works and what doesn't, so we don't reinvent the wheel? So we rely on our mentors and our friends in such coalitions and platforms. But when meetings are too frequent, people also tend to feel burnout. We might be working from home, but we might feel as though we are being micromanaged, right? This doesn't apply to my current organization, right? It's just in general. in general, how positively someone feels about it and their relationship with others in their movement and others in the same circle. I believe capacity building is very important, not just for the advocates who are working directly in the movement, but also those in community groups and in other NGOs. So if someone from the environmental movement approaches us and say, oh, I want to encourage more people in my organization to go plant-based, I want them to serve plant-based food at events, we must be ready to offer assistance. So my personal policy is never say no. Whenever someone says, can you do a talk for my organization? Can you come to my school or university to do a talk? Can you give a workshop for my students? I never say no.
Thanks, Lynn. I think to me, like transfer of knowledge will always be a work in progress. There is never going to be this area that we've reached where we're like, now there is this complete transference and everyone, like it's impossible to happen. I do think for good information kind of exchange, one thing that's really important, and I think this point has been kind of made, but organizations like ACE or coalitions do this so well, is to kind of have facilitators who are removing themselves, but are really just kind of organizing the conversation and holding it, because maybe more so in Asia than in the West, the need to create warmth in the room, the need to kind of have that personal connection before knowledge exchange starts is so important. So I think it's like a 4-month run-up to just say, hey, now we're friends and we know enough that we can share trade secrets, that we can talk about how we did this, or I did this sneaky thing that worked with that particular corporate and I'm happy to now share it in this forum. So I think that build-up requires resources, requires patience. And it is very giving in the long run. So I think if we can start doing that, putting resources into information and knowledge exchange with the hopes that it will reap benefits in the long run, and know that it's always going to be a work in progress, I guess.
So you all actually had some more questions, but you're very familiar with this. There are always more great ideas than you have time to work on. So I hope that you're willing to look at the questions that are here, but I think all of you should also feel some responsibility to answer the questions that your fellow audience members have asked. Be like Wong, Lynn, and don't say no. But yeah, thank you, the three of you, for the work that you do, for answering my questions and for answering audience questions, and thank you to all of you for this work. Thank you to the people over there who do the sound too. These are some of the better microphones that I've used in talks, so I appreciate it. And yeah, thank you. Keep doing what you're doing. And one more round of applause.